They say Utah's Red Rock Canyons hold secrets older than time itself. But some secrets should never be unearthed. Tonight, we're diving deep into 3 of the most terrifying true stories ever to emerge from the Beehive State. Stories that will make you question everything you thought you knew about this seemingly peaceful landscape. Stories that locals whisper about in hushed tones, afraid that speaking too loudly might summon something best left undisturbed. From abandoned mining towns where the dead refuse to rest, to highways haunted by phantoms that refuse to move on, to caves that echo with screams that have no source, Utah's dark history is about to reveal itself. And I promise you, by the end of this video, you'll never look at Utah the same way again. So turn off your lights, lock your doors, and whatever you do, don't watch this alone. If you're brave enough to continue, hit that subscribe button right now because things are about to get absolutely terrifying. You don't want to miss what happens next. The sun was setting over the abandoned town of Grafton, casting long shadows across the weathered wooden structures that somehow still stood after more than a century of neglect. Sarah Mitchell had always been fascinated by ghost towns, and Grafton, nestled in the southwestern corner of Utah near Zion National Park, was supposed to be the crown jewel of her photography portfolio. She'd read about its history, how Mormon settlers had established it in 1859, how the Virgin River had flooded it repeatedly, how Apache raids and disease had slowly choked the life out of the community until the last residents finally gave up and left in the 1940s. What she hadn't read about were the things that supposedly stayed behind. Sarah arrived at 4 p.m. on a crisp October afternoon in 2019, giving herself plenty of time to capture the golden hour light that photographers dream about. The town was more isolated than she'd expected. The nearest paved road had stopped working about 20 minutes into the dirt road leading to Grafton, but she'd printed directions from a ghost town enthusiast forum, and they'd gotten her there safely enough. The silence was the first thing that struck her. Not peaceful silence, but the kind of thick, oppressive quiet that makes your ears ring and your heart beat a little faster. Even the wind seemed too reluctant to disturb this place. Sarah grabbed her camera bag and tripod from the trunk of her Honda Civic and started toward the most photogenic structure, a small, whitewashed schoolhouse that stood remarkably intact after more than a century of neglect. When she framed her first shot, she noticed something odd in her viewfinder. There appeared to be a figure standing in one of the schoolhouse windows. She lowered her camera and looked with her naked eye. Nothing. She raised the camera again. There it was, a dark silhouette, completely still, watching her. "Just shadows and old glass playing tricks," she muttered to herself, but her hands were trembling slightly as she adjusted her settings. For the next hour, Sarah moved through the ghost town, documenting the old cemetery where weathered headstones marked graves from the 1860s, the ruined homes with their collapsed roofs and gaping doorways, and the remains of a small church. With each location, she felt increasingly uneasy. It wasn't just the isolation or the fading light, it was the persistent feeling that she wasn't alone. Several times she spun around, certain she'd heard footsteps in the dry brush behind her, but she never saw anyone. The cemetery was where things took a darker turn. Sarah was photographing a particularly poignant grave marker, a small stone for a child who had died at age 4 in 1866, when she heard it. A child's laughter, high and clear, coming from somewhere among the headstones. She froze, her blood turning to ice in her veins. "Hello?" she called out, her voice cracking slightly. "Is someone there?" The laughter came again, closer this time, and definitely that of a young child. But as Sarah scanned the cemetery, she saw no one. The sun was dipping toward the horizon now, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, and the temperature had noticeably dropped. She decided it was time to leave. That's when she realized her car keys were missing. Sarah frantically checked every pocket, her camera bag, the ground around her. Nothing. She distinctly remembered putting them in her jacket pocket, but they were gone. Panic began to set in as the reality of her situation crystallized. She was alone in an abandoned town, miles from the nearest help, and night was falling fast. She hurried back to where she'd parked, hoping against hope that maybe she'd left the keys in the ignition. As she passed the schoolhouse again, every window was now filled with dark figures. She could see them clearly this time. Men, women, children, all dressed in old-fashioned clothing, all perfectly still, all watching her with expressions she couldn't quite make out in the fading light. Sarah ran. She didn't care about the expensive camera equipment bouncing painfully against her back or the tripod she'd dropped. She just ran toward her car, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her mind refusing to process what she was seeing. When she reached the parking area, her car sat alone in the growing darkness. And there, hanging from the rearview mirror on the inside, were her keys. Inside the locked car. The car she distinctly remembered locking when she arrived. No, 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 she whispered, trying every door handle, even though she could see they were locked. She was trapped. Night had fallen completely now, and the old town behind her seemed to be waking up. She could hear sounds, voices speaking in hushed tones, the creak of doors opening, footsteps on wooden porches. When she turned to look, she saw lights flickering in the windows of buildings she knew had no electricity, no gas, no source of light whatsoever. Sarah pulled out her phone. No signal, of course, but she activated the flashlight and started walking down the dirt road towards civilization. She'd gone maybe 100 yards when she heard her name being called. Not shouted, but spoken clearly, as if someone was standing right next to her. Sarah. Sarah Mitchell. She spun around, her phone's light cutting through the darkness. A woman stood on the road behind her, wearing a long dress from another century, her face pale and gaunt. But it was her eyes that made Sarah's scream catch in her throat. They were completely black, like pools of ink, reflecting no light at all. You disturbed our rest. You took our images. You must return them. More figures emerged from the darkness, surrounding Sarah on all sides. Men with weathered faces and empty eyes, children with dirt-stained clothes and unnaturally still expressions, all of them moving in complete silence, gliding rather than walking across the rough ground. Sarah did the only thing she could think of. She pulled the memory card from her camera and threw it on the ground. Take it! Take all of it! I don't want them! The figures stopped advancing. The woman who had spoken bent down and picked up the tiny card, examining it with a puzzled expression. Then, impossibly, the memory card began to glow with a soft blue light, and wisps of smoke or mist seemed to flow from it into the gathered ghosts. Sarah watched in horror and fascination as the spirit seemed to absorb the captured images of their town, their graves, their afterlife. When the glow faded, the woman looked at Sarah again, and for just a moment, her eyes weren't black anymore. They were sad and tired and human. She whispered, "Go, and never return. Some places are not meant for the living." The spirits vanished, as if they'd never been there at all. Sarah found herself standing alone on the dark road, her phone's flashlight the only illumination for miles. She turned and ran, not stopping until her lungs burned and her legs threatened to give out. When she finally looked back, Grafton had disappeared into the darkness behind her. She walked for 3 hours before she found a highway and flagged down a passing truck. The driver, an older man, who said he'd lived in the area his whole life, wasn't surprised by her story. "Grafton's got a reputation," he said simply. "Folks who go there after dark, well, let's just say you're not the first to come running out with a story like that. You're lucky you got out at all." When police retrieved Sarah's car the next day, they found her keys still hanging from the rearview mirror. The doors were unlocked. Her camera was never found, though she never went back to look for it. And sometimes, late at night, Sarah Mitchell still hears that child's laughter echoing in her memory, reminding her that some photographs are better left untaken, and some places are better left alone. If you're still with me after that terrifying tale from Grafton, you're braver than most. But trust me, what's coming next will test that courage even further. Make sure you've hit that like button because this next story from Utah's dark highways will leave you speechless. Highway 191 stretches through some of the most desolate and hauntingly beautiful landscape in southeastern Utah. It's a road that cuts through Red Rock canyons, passes ancient Native American ruins, and winds through areas so remote that cell phone service is nothing but a distant memory. Truck drivers and locals know this highway well, but they also know to be careful after midnight, especially near the stretch between Moab and Blanding, because that's where she appears. Marcus Webb had been driving trucks for 15 years, hauling freight across the American Southwest, and he'd heard all the stories. Every highway has its legends: phantom hitchhikers, mysterious lights, unexplained accidents. He'd always dismissed them as the products of tired minds and overactive imaginations. That dismissal ended on a cold February night in 2021. Marcus was running behind schedule. A delay at the loading dock in Colorado had put him hours off his planned route, and he was pushing to make up time. It was 2:47 a.m. when he entered the loneliest stretch of Highway 191, his 18-wheeler's headlights cutting through the absolute darkness of the Utah night. No moon, no stars visible through the cloud cover, just the endless ribbon of asphalt ahead and the rocky wilderness on either side. He'd been driving for about 20 minutes when he saw her standing on the shoulder of the road, illuminated by his headlights. A young woman, maybe 25 years old, wearing a white dress that seemed far too thin for the freezing temperature. Her dark hair hung loose around her shoulders, and she had her thumb out in the universal gesture of a hitchhiker. Marcus's first instinct was to keep driving. He had a strict policy about not picking up hitchhikers, especially in the middle of nowhere at 3 a.m. But something made him slow down. Maybe it was the way she looked so vulnerable and cold, or maybe it was the complete absence of any other vehicle, any house, any sign of civilization for miles in either direction. Where had she come from? How had she gotten out here? Against his better judgment, Marcus brought the big rig to a stop about 50 yards past where she stood. He watched in his side mirror as she walked toward the truck, moving with an odd, gliding gait that made his stomach tighten with unease. When she reached the passenger door, he leaned over and opened it. Up close, she was even more striking, beautiful in an otherworldly way, with pale skin and dark eyes that seemed to reflect the dashboard lights strangely. But it was her dress that really caught his attention. It wasn't just thin. It was old-fashioned, like something from the 1950s or 60s, and despite the cold wind that had been buffeting his truck, it didn't move or flutter at all. "Thank you for stopping," she said, her voice soft and melodic. "I need to get to Blanding. It's very important." "Blanding's about 40 miles up the road. You got family there? Someone I can call to let them know you're coming?" "My mother is waiting for me." "She's been waiting for a very long time." As she settled into the passenger seat, Marcus noticed two things that made his blood run cold. First, she cast no reflection in the rearview mirror. Second, although she had just come in from the freezing night air, no warmth radiated from her body. In fact, the cab had seemed to have gotten colder since she had entered. Marcus put the truck in gear, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles went white. He tried to rationalize what he was experiencing. Maybe the mirror was at a bad angle. Maybe the heater was malfunctioning. Maybe he was just exhausted and his perception was off. "What were you doing out there?" he asked, trying to keep the conversation normal. "Did your car break down?" "I've been waiting," she said simply, staring straight ahead through the windshield. "I wait every night. Someone always stops eventually." "Every night?" Marcus glanced at her, and his heart nearly stopped. In profile, he could see through her. Just slightly, just enough to make out the passenger window behind her translucent form. "Listen, are you okay? Do you need medical attention?" She turned to look at him then, and her eyes were no longer dark. They were empty, hollow sockets that seemed to contain the vastness of space itself. "I died on this road 63 years ago. My boyfriend was driving too fast. We rolled the car 7 times. He walked away without a scratch. I wasn't so lucky." Marcus slammed on the brakes and the truck shuddered to a stop in the middle of the highway. He was breathing hard, his mind refusing to accept what he was seeing and hearing. "You need to get out," he managed to say. "You need to get out of my truck right now." "I can't," she said, and now her voice was filled with infinite sorrow. "Until we reach the spot where it happened, until someone finally stops and listens to my story. Will you listen, Marcus Webb? Will you hear what happened to Gloria Martinez on February 14th, 1958? He hadn't told her his name. He was certain of it. But she knew it anyway, just like she seemed to know everything else. Marcus couldn't speak, couldn't move. He could only listen as Gloria, or the thing that called itself Gloria, began to tell her story. She and her boyfriend Tommy had been coming back from a Valentine's Day dance in Moab. Tommy had been drinking, though he'd promised he'd stay sober. They'd been arguing about his drinking, about his jealousy, about his temper. The argument had gotten heated, and Tommy had accelerated, pushing his 1955 Chevrolet Bel Air faster and faster down the dark highway, trying to scare her into silence. "He lost control at mile marker 97, Gloria said, her translucent hand pointing ahead through the windshield, right there, where the road curves around that outcropping. We went off the road, tumbled down the embankment. I was thrown from the car. My neck broke on the first impact, but I was conscious for a few seconds afterward, long enough to see Tommy climb out of the wreckage, long enough to see him look at my body, long enough to see him run away." "He left you?" Marcus whispered, horror and pity warring in his chest. "He left me," Gloria confirmed. "He hitched a ride to Blanding and told everyone I'd decided to stay with friends in Moab. It took 3 days for anyone to find the wreckage. By then, animals had... well, it doesn't matter. What matters is that Tommy never faced justice. He moved to California, got married, had children, lived a long and happy life. He died in his sleep in 2003, surrounded by family who thought he was a good man." Tears were streaming down Marcus's face now, though he couldn't say exactly why he was crying. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry that happened to you." "I've been trying to get home ever since," Gloria said, "trying to get to my mother's house in Blanding, but I never make it. Every time someone picks me up, we reach mile marker 97, and then I'm back at the beginning, waiting on the side of the road again. It's been 63 years of the same night, over and over." Marcus looked at the odometer. They were approaching mile marker 95, 2 miles to go. "What happens when we reach the spot?" he asked. "I don't know," Gloria admitted. "I've never gotten past it with a driver who knew the truth. They always panic, they always stop and kick me out, and I always end up back at the beginning. But you listened, you heard my story. Maybe that will make a difference." Mile marker 96 passed by. Marcus's foot was steady on the accelerator, his eyes locked on the road ahead. He could see the curve Gloria had described, the rocky outcropping that marked the place where she had died. His entire body was trembling, but he didn't slow down. "Whatever happens, I'm getting you past this point. I'm breaking this cycle," he said. Gloria turned to look at him, and for a moment, her hollow eyes filled with something that looked like hope. "Thank you," she whispered. Mile marker 97 appeared in the headlights. The curve was coming up fast. Marcus maintained his speed, gripping the wheel, determined to see this through. As they reached the exact spot where Gloria had died, the temperature in the cab dropped so dramatically that Marcus's breath came out in clouds of vapor. The windshield frosted over instantly. The radio erupted in static and screams, and Gloria screamed. It was a sound of pure anguish, of decades of trapped pain and loneliness and despair finally being released. The sound filled the truck, filled Marcus's head, seemed to fill the entire night. He couldn't see through the frosted windshield, but he didn't dare stop. He drove blind, trusting his memory of the road, praying he wouldn't veer off the highway. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The temperature normalized. The frost vanished. The radio went silent. Marcus could see again, and the road stretched out ahead of him, empty and dark and normal. Gloria was gone. Marcus pulled over, his entire body shaking. He sat there for 10 minutes trying to process what had just happened. Finally, he grabbed his phone, hoping against hope that he'd have signal. He did, barely, 1 bar, but enough. He dialed 911. This is going to sound crazy, but I need you to look up an accident report from February 14, 1958 on Highway 191 around mile marker 97. The victim's name was Gloria Martinez. There was a long pause, then keyboard clicking. Sir, I'm showing that accident in our historical database. How did you... What's the status of the victim? Was her body recovered? Was she buried? More clicking, another pause. Sir, according to this report, Gloria Martinez's body was found, but her mother couldn't afford a proper burial. She was interred in an unmarked grave in the Blanding Cemetery. The mother passed away a few months later, reportedly of a broken heart. Marcus thanked the dispatcher and hung up. He sat in his truck as the sun began to rise over the Utah wilderness, painting the rocks in shades of gold and red. He'd been up all night, but he wasn't tired. He had one more thing to do. 3 hours later, Marcus Webb walked into a monument company in Blanding and paid for a proper headstone for Gloria Martinez. He used his own money he'd been saving for a new fishing boat, and he didn't regret it for a second. The stone was simple but beautiful. Gloria Martinez, 1933 to 1958, beloved daughter, finally home. Marcus never drove Highway 191 at night again, but he made a point to visit Gloria's grave once a year, always on February 14th. He'd leave flowers and tell her about his life, about the places he'd been, about the beauty he'd seen, and he never saw her ghost again. But other drivers did. To this day, people report seeing a young woman in a white dress hitchhiking on Highway 191 between Moab and Blanding. Most don't stop. Those who do tell similar stories. A beautiful ghost, a tragic tale, a desperate plea to reach Blanding. But now, when they reach mile marker 97, she doesn't scream anymore. She simply says thank you and fades away, finally able to rest because someone, somewhere, cared enough to hear her story and give her the dignity that she'd been denied for so long. The phantom hitchhiker of Highway 191 isn't gone, she's just not suffering anymore. And sometimes, late at night, truck drivers swear they see 2 figures standing together near mile marker 97, a young woman in a white dress and an older woman with kind eyes, finally reunited after decades apart. Some curses aren't meant to be broken. Some are meant to be healed with compassion and remembrance, and some ghosts just need someone to listen. We're reaching the final and most terrifying story of tonight's journey into Utah's darkest corners. If the first 2 stories shook you, this last one will haunt your dreams for weeks to come. Stay with me until the very end. You won't believe what happens. And don't forget to drop a comment telling me which story scared you the most. Mount Timpanogos stands as a sentinel over Utah Valley, its limestone caves drawing thousands of visitors every year to marvel at the stunning formations created over millions of years. The official tours are safe, well-lit, and carefully managed by park rangers who know every inch of the explored caverns. But beneath those tourist-friendly passages lies a network of unmapped tunnels and chambers that the Park Service doesn't talk about. Tunnels that were sealed off decades ago for reasons that have nothing to do with safety and everything to do with the things that were heard down there in the darkness. In the summer of 2018, 3 experienced cavers, Jennifer Torres, David Kim, and Mike Patterson, decided they were going to explore those forbidden sections. They'd heard rumors of a hidden entrance, an old mining shaft that connected to the sealed-off portions of the cave system. They had obtained historical maps from the 1940s, back when amateur cavers had more freedom to explore. They had top-of-the-line equipment, years of experience, and the kind of confidence that comes from having conquered dozens of cave systems across the western United States. What they didn't have was any idea what they were walking into. The trio began their descent on July 17th at 6 a.m., planning to spend approximately 8 hours underground. They'd told Jennifer's husband exactly where they were going and when to expect them back. They'd filed all the proper permits for the legal sections of the cave. They had checked and double-checked their equipment. They were prepared for everything, or so they thought. The entrance they used was exactly where the old maps indicated, a narrow shaft hidden behind thick brush about 2 miles from the main cave entrance. The shaft descended at a steep angle, requiring them to rappel down roughly 60 feet before it opened into a wider tunnel. Their helmet lamps cut through the absolute darkness as they made their way deeper into the mountain. For the first 2 hours, everything went according to plan. They documented stunning formations that no one had photographed in decades, crystalline structures that glittered in their lamplight, underground pools so clear they looked like mirrors, columns of stone that stretched from floor to ceiling like the pillars of some ancient cathedral. Jennifer took hundreds of photos while David carefully mapped their route and Mike tested the air quality at regular intervals. They were approximately 1.5 miles into the unmapped section when they heard the first scream. It was distant but unmistakable, a human scream, high-pitched and full of terror, echoing through the tunnels from somewhere ahead of them. All three froze, their lights swinging toward the direction of the sound. "Hello?" David called out, his voice bouncing off the stone walls. "Is someone down here? Do you need help?" Silence. The kind of profound, crushing silence that only exists deep underground, where no sound from the surface world can penetrate. They waited, listening, but the scream didn't repeat. "Could be other cavers who got lost," Jennifer suggested, though her voice was uncertain. "We should check it out." They proceeded cautiously, following the tunnel in the direction the scream had come from. The passage narrowed, forcing them to move single file, with Mike leading, Jennifer in the middle, and David bringing up the rear. The walls pressed closer on either side, and the ceiling lowered until they had to crouch to continue. That's when the screaming started in earnest. Not just one voice this time, but many. Dozens, maybe hundreds of voices all screaming at once, in a cacophony of terror and agony that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The sound was so overwhelming, so utterly horrifying that Jennifer clapped her hands over her ears and sank to her knees. Mike spun around, his light swinging wildly, trying to locate the source. David started backing up, his breathing rapid and panicked. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. "We need to get out of here," David said, his voice shaking. "Right now. This isn't natural." But Mike was staring ahead into the darkness beyond his lamplight, his face pale and drawn. "There's something there," he whispered. "In the tunnel ahead, I saw movement." Jennifer slowly got up to her feet, her hands still trembling. "Mike, there's nothing there. It's just shadows and—" The scream that interrupted her was different from the others. This one was close, so close it seemed to come from right beside them, and it was accompanied by a blast of freezing air that made their breath visible in the lamplight. But worse than the scream or the cold was the smell that came with it, the unmistakable stench of decay, of death, of something that had been rotting in the darkness for a very long time. They ran. All three of them, abandoning their careful documentation and methodical exploration, simply turned and ran back the way they had come, their lamps bouncing crazily as they scrambled through the narrow passage, scraping elbows and knees on the rough stone, gasping for breath in the thin air. Behind them, the screaming followed, not fading with distance as it should, but maintaining the same volume no matter how far they fled. David, who was now in the lead, skidded to a halt so suddenly that Jennifer crashed into him. "No," he said, his voice hollow with disbelief. "No, no, no!" The tunnel ahead, the tunnel they had come through less than 10 minutes ago, was different. The familiar formations were gone, replaced by smooth walls that looked almost artificially carved. The passage branched in 3 directions, none of which had been there before.
"This isn't possible," Mike said, coming up behind them. "We mapped this section. There's only one way back." "The caves are changing," Jennifer whispered, and even as she said it, she could see the walls subtly shifting, the stone flowing like water in slow motion, rearranging itself. "Oh God, the caves are alive." The screaming had stopped, replaced by something worse. Whispers. Thousands of overlapping whispers in a language none of them recognized, echoing from the 3 passages ahead. And within those whispers, they began to hear words they understood. Their names, their fears, their secrets. "Jennifer, remember what you did to your sister," the whispers hissed. "You were jealous. You wanted her to fail. You sabotaged her college application. David, you're not really successful. You're a fraud. Everyone knows it. They laugh at you behind your back. Michael, your father was right about you. You'll never amount to anything. You're weak. You're pathetic. Each whisper struck like a physical blow, targeting their deepest insecurities and hidden shames. Jennifer sank against the wall, tears streaming down her face. David was hyperventilating, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold his lamp. Only Mike seemed able to resist, though his face was twisted with effort. "It's not real!" Mike shouted, his voice echoing through the tunnels. "It's feeding on our fear! Don't listen to it!" But the entity, or entities, in the caves had just begun. The walls around them began to change more dramatically now, formations sprouting from the stone like fast-growing plants. Except these weren't beautiful crystalline structures. These were shapes that hurt to look at, geometries that shouldn't exist in three-dimensional space, angles that made their eyes water and their minds rebel. And in the stone itself, faces began to appear. Human faces, twisted in expressions of eternal torment, mouths open in silent screams. Some looked ancient, weathered by centuries. Others looked fresh, almost alive. Jennifer recognized one of them, a young man who had disappeared while hiking near Timpanogos 3 years ago. His face was pressed against the stone as if trapped just beneath the surface, his eyes following her movement with desperate pleading. "They're not dead," David said, his voice breaking. "They're not dead. They're trapped. Trapped in the stone. Conscious, aware, forever." The entities, or entity, in the caves confirmed it, speaking in unison now. "Join us. Stay with us. Become part of the mountain. Feed the ancient hunger that dwells in the deep places. We were like you once. We came seeking adventure, seeking knowledge, seeking glory. Now we are eternal. Now we are legion. Now we are the mountain's memory." Mike grabbed Jennifer and David, shaking them. "We have to move. Pick a tunnel. Any tunnel. Standing still means we die here." They chose the middle passage for no reason other than it seemed slightly wider than the other two. As they entered it, the faces in the walls began to scream, not audibly, but silently, their mouths stretched impossibly wide, their eyes bulging with terror and madness. The 3 cavers ran past them, trying not to look, trying not to think about what they were seeing. The tunnel twisted and turned, seemingly at random, sometimes widening into chambers filled with impossible formations, sometimes narrowing until they had to crawl on their bellies through gaps barely large enough to accommodate them. Time lost all meaning in the unchanging darkness. They might have been underground for hours or days. There was no way to tell. It was Jennifer who first noticed that they weren't alone in the tunnel. Something was keeping pace with them just beyond the reach of their lamps. Something large and many-legged that made wet, clicking sounds as it moved across the stone. When they stopped, it stopped. When they moved, it followed. They never got a clear look at it, which was probably a mercy. They came eventually to a vast chamber, so large their lights couldn't reach the ceiling or the far walls. The floor was covered in a thick layer of what looked like ash or bone dust. And in the center of the chamber stood a structure that couldn't possibly be natural. A massive stone door covered with symbols that predated any known human civilization. "This is impossible," David said, approaching the door despite Mike's warnings. "This looks like it's been here for millions of years, but these symbols, they're a language, a writing system. That means intelligence. That means—" The door opened. Not slowly, not with any sound of grinding stone, but instantly, as if it had never been closed at all. And beyond it was not a chamber, but a void, absolute nothingness that seemed to swallow their lamplight. And from that void came a presence so overwhelming, so fundamentally alien and hostile to human existence, that all 3 of them collapsed to their knees, blood streaming from their noses and ears. The entity that dwelled beyond the door was old. older than the mountain, older than the continent, perhaps older than the earth itself. It had been trapped there by forces unknown, sealed away in the deepest darkness, waiting with infinite patience for the chance to break free, and it was hungry, so terribly, impossibly hungry. Images flooded their minds, cities of stone inhabited by things that were never human, vast underground oceans teeming with blind horrors, rituals performed in the darkness by worshippers who carved away their own flesh to please their imprisoned god. They saw what would happen if the entity broke free. A plague of madness spreading across the surface world, every cave and mine shaft and basement becoming a gateway for the things that dwelt below. Humanity reduced to cattle or slaves or building materials for structures that would blot out the sun. "Close your eyes," Mike screamed, and they obeyed, though closing their eyes did nothing to block out the visions. "We have to seal it! We have to close the door!" But they couldn't move. The entity's presence pinned them to the ground like insects on a board. They could feel it reaching out, extending tentacles of thought into their minds, learning about the surface world through their memories, planning its emergence. That's when Jennifer did something that saved them all. With trembling hands, she pulled out her camera and took a photograph, the flash momentarily illuminating the chamber. The entity recoiled from the light, not because the light hurt it, but because the photograph captured something. Evidence. Proof. A record that could expose its existence to the surface world.
In that moment of distraction, David managed to reach the door. He didn't pull it closed. He couldn't have. It weighed tons. Instead, he pressed his hand against one of the ancient symbols, and the door slammed shut with a sound like thunder, the vibration knocking them all off their feet. The presence vanished. The chamber was suddenly just a chamber, large, dark, and empty, but no longer suffused with that overwhelming alien intelligence. They lay gasping on the stone floor, their minds reeling from what they'd experienced. "We have to get out," David said, "before it finds another way through." They ran, following tunnels that now seemed to lead consistently upward, as if the mountain itself wanted them gone. The whispers had stopped. The screaming had stopped. The faces in the walls were just patterns in the stone. Whatever intelligence had animated the caves had withdrawn, perhaps weakened by the closing of the door, perhaps simply watching and waiting. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 2 hours, they saw it, natural light filtering down from above. The exit shaft. They'd made it. They climbed with desperate energy, hauling themselves up the rope they'd left behind, not speaking, barely breathing, focused only on reaching the surface. They emerged into late afternoon sunlight that felt like a physical caress after the oppressive darkness below. They lay on the ground outside the entrance, sobbing with relief, unable to process what they had experienced. Jennifer's husband found them there an hour later. They were dehydrated, exhausted, and traumatized, but alive. When park rangers tried to bet their statement, they couldn't explain coherently what had happened. The footage from Jennifer's camera showed only static and strange lights. The only photo that came out was the one she'd taken in the final chamber. It showed the door, covered in its impossible symbols, and something that might have been a shadow or might have been something else, something reaching toward the lens. The Park Service sealed the entrance shaft they'd used, pouring concrete into it and posting guards for a week to make sure it stayed sealed. Official reports cited dangerous, unstable rock formations as the reason. The 3 cavers were asked to sign non-disclosure agreements and were strongly encouraged never to speak about what they'd seen. But sometimes, hikers on Mount Timpanogos report hearing things coming from deep within the mountain. Screaming that sounds human but isn't quite right. Whispers that seem to come from the stone itself. And occasionally, someone hiking at night swears they see a faint glow coming from cracks in the mountainside. Not the warm light of fire or electricity, but a cold, alien luminescence that seems to pulse with malevolent intelligence. The Timpanogos caves remain open to tourists, and thousands visit every year, marveling at the natural beauty without knowing what lies deeper in the mountain. The park rangers know, though. They know, and they listen carefully to the stone, waiting for the day when the screaming starts and doesn't stop, when the whispers become loud enough to hear on the surface, when the ancient door opens once again and the things below finally break free. Until that day comes, they watch and wait and pray that the seal holds, because they know that beneath the beauty and majesty of Mount Timpanogos, something ancient and hungry sleeps in the darkness, something that has waited millions of years and can wait millions more. Something that knows humanity's time on Earth is temporary, but the deep places are forever. And sometimes, late at night, when the mountain is quiet and still, you can hear it dreaming, and its dreams are screaming. So there you have it, 3 terrifying true stories from the shadows of Utah, from the vengeful spirits of Grafton who refuse to let their rest be disturbed, to the tragic phantom of Highway 191 seeking the peace she was denied, to the ancient horror lurking beneath Mount Timpanogos, waiting in the darkness. These aren't just stories, these are warnings. Warnings that some places hold secrets we're not meant to discover, that some doors are sealed for good reason, that the beauty we see on the surface sometimes hides unimaginable horror just beneath. Utah's landscape may be breathtaking, but now you know what else calls it home. The next time you're driving alone on a dark highway, or exploring an abandoned town, or venturing into a cave system, remember these stories. Remember that you're never quite as alone as you think you are. And remember that some mysteries are better left unsolved. What other dark corners of America should we explore next? What secrets are hiding in your state, waiting to be uncovered? The darkness is everywhere, my friends, and we've only just begun to shine a light into its depths. Stay curious, stay cautious, and most importantly, stay tuned, because the next journey into terror is just around the corner, and you won't want to miss it. If this video gave you chills, hit that subscribe button, smash the like, and drop a comment telling me which story haunted you the most.